When the outer listening stations around Sol first went dark, the prevailing assumption within the Orion Compact was equipment failure. Because Earth was supposed to fall quietly, the way all unaligned frontier worlds eventually did, and the idea that the silence meant something worse simply did not fit the models that had been used for 300 standard cycles to predict human behavior, models that described humans as noisy, argumentative, inventive in small inefficient ways, and ultimately pliable once sufficient pressure was applied. So the report that reached the Galactic Harmonization Council described the blackout as a temporary anomaly while the enforcement fleets were already en route, their admiral confident, their crews bored, and their political handlers rehearsing the phrasing of the surrender ultimatum they would broadcast once they reached the heliopause, unaware that on Earth the silence had been deliberate, chosen after a final close session in a chamber buried beneath old mountains where the walls were scarred with plaques naming wars humanity had sworn never to repeat yet had studied obsessively, and where President Mara Ionescu listened while Admiral Kade spoke in a voice that carried no excitement and no fear as he explained that the stars were about to become very dangerous places for anyone who assumed humans fought the way they negotiated, because negotiation was what humans did when they still believed the other side could be reasoned with, and the decision to stop talking had been unanimous not because humanity agreed on much, but because every faction recognized the pattern repeating itself, the polite dismissal, the escalating sanctions, the protective embargoes that were not protection at all, and finally the enforcement action justified as stabilization, and as the Council fleets crossed the last legal boundary before human space, they received the surrender demand they expected, except it did not come from Earth. It came from an automated boy broadcasting a simple statement in several dozen languages stating that Sol was closed, traffic was not advised, and that continued approach would be interpreted as intent to interfere with internal human matters, a phrasing so mild that the fleet commander laughed and ordered the message archived for later review, because no minor species warned the Council. The Council warned them, and behind him the stars ahead flickered once, just enough for the sensors to register a distortion that was logged and ignored, while on Mars the red dust storms continued to roll over silent shipyards where vessels far larger than any previously registered human design waited in cold readiness, their hulls dark and unmarked, built without ceremony, because humanity had learned long ago that the most dangerous things were the ones you did not feel the need to show off, and as the enforcement fleet accelerated, their formation perfect, their confidence absolute, a junior sensor officer noticed that background radiation levels were changing in patterns that suggested controlled manipulation rather than natural variance, and when she reported it she was told to recalibrate and stop looking for ghosts, because Earth was supposed to fall, because history said it always did, and the first real sign that the models were wrong came when the stars behind the fleet went out one by one, not exploding, not collapsing, simply vanishing from every spectrum at once as if someone had reached into the sky and erased them, and in the sudden darkness the human message repeated itself calmly, unchanged, stating that Sol was closed and traffic was not advised, and somewhere deep under Earth's crust, surrounded by people who understood exactly what had just been unleashed, Admiral Kade closed his eyes for a moment, not in regret but in acknowledgement, because this was a point of no return. The moment humanity stopped being a problem to be managed and became a reality to be survived, and across the galaxy, as relays failed and charts rewrote themselves in real time, ancient warnings buried in dismissed archives began to surface, warnings written by civilizations long extinct that had seen humans once, briefly, and had chosen distance over dominance, warnings that said only this, that Earth does not fall, that Earth endures, and that when pushed hard enough, it does not break. It changes the shape of the stars themselves. The Orion Compact enforcement fleet did not panic immediately when the starfield behind them vanished, because panic was a human word and Compact doctrine preferred terms like anomaly response and contingency alignment, and so Admiral Veshtar, the Third Harmonization Armada, ordered his navigators to verify positional integrity, assuming some exotic human jamming or localized spatial distortion. But verification failed across every redundant system, as reference stars use of millennia were simply not there anymore. Not occluded, not shifted, but absent, and the realization spread to the command decks in a cold, creeping way that something fundamental had been altered, not just obscured, while long-range comms began to fill with overlapping reports from other task groups describing identical losses of stellar reference points, entire constellations gone as if the galaxy itself had been edited. And still the human boy repeated its message with maddening calm. Sol was closed. Traffic was not advised, and interference would be interpreted as hostile intent, a statement that now carried a very different weight. Because behind the boy, space itself behaved incorrectly. Gravity wells subtly misaligned, light bending in ways that violated accepted constants, and when a probe was launched to test the darkness, it transmitted data for exactly 12 seconds before its signal stretched, elongated, and then flattened into noise as if time had been smeared thin, prompting one of Veshtar's science adepts to whisper an old heretical phrase that should not have existed in a modern fleet. Stellar-scale engineering, a concept dismissed centuries ago as impractical mythology, because no civilization built with stars. They lived near them at best, harvested them carefully, but humans had never cared much for best practices, and on Earth, far from the fear spreading through alien command channels, President Ionescu listened as technicians confirmed phase lattice stabilization across the Perseus Curtain, a structure that did not look like anything on a screen because it was not an object so much as a condition, a rearrangement of probabilities and energy states seeded through dead systems over generations, activated only now because humanity had always planned for the day diplomacy failed, not because they wanted war, but because they understood history, their own and everyone else's, and history said that eventually someone would mistake restraint for weakness. While Admiral Kade briefed a room full of civilian leaders on what would happen next, that the enforcement fleets would attempt to advance, that they would find navigation increasingly unreliable, that some ships would disappear entirely without debris, not destroyed but displaced into regions of altered space-time where rescue was impossible, and that the galaxy would begin to understand that Earth was no longer defended by fleets alone, but by geography rewritten on a stellar scale. And out in the dark, Admiral Veshtar finally ordered a retreat vector plotted, only to be told that retreat relative to what was now an unsolved problem, because without stars, without fixed points, direction itself had become a suggestion rather than a rule, and as the first human vessels emerged from nothingness, not through hyperspace wakes or jump signatures, but simply appearing as if they had always been there, silent, massive, and unarmed in any way the Compact could easily identify, the human transmission changed for the first time, not louder, not angrier, but more personal, stating that this was a final advisory, that humanity did not wish to pursue hostile actors beyond the closed region, and that compliance now would result in assistance, a word that sent a ripple of disbelief through alien crews who had never imagined needing help from the species they had come to subdue, and as stars continued to go dark farther out, cascading beyond the initial engagement zone, relays across the Orion Compact began to fail in sequence, not attacked, not sabotaged, but rendered irrelevant by a human decision that space itself would no longer behave the way the galaxy expected. Because Earth was never meant to fall, it was meant to endure long enough to learn how to make sure no one else ever made that mistake again. Panic finally took root not in the forward elements of the Orion Compact fleet, but in the rear echelons of civilian corridors of power as reports propagated outward faster than any human weapon ever had. Because stars vanishing was one thing, but navigation itself becoming unreliable was something no treaty, doctrine, or fleet strength could counter. And on the capital world of Kaf Prime, the Harmonization Council convened an emergency session beneath vaulted chambers designed to inspire permanence, where delegates argued in clipped formal tones that failed to hide the fear leaking into their pheromones and vocal phrases. Archivists unearthed forbidden records describing entities that had not conquered so much as redefined the battlefield they occupied, records long dismissed as pre-unification superstition until now, when the descriptions of silent human vessels and regions of altered causality matched sensor data with unsettling precision, while on the edges of the Perseus Curtain individual compact ships attempted desperate experiments, firing weapons into the darkness only to watch energy disperse into harmless probability noise, launching drones that returned seconds before they were sent or not at all, and in one infamous incident a cruiser emerged from the distortion with its crew aged decades in minutes, its captain dying mid-sentence as time reasserted itself unevenly, a horror that spread through fleet channels faster than any official order to maintain discipline, because nothing terrified professional militaries more than weapons that did not behave like weapons at all, and still the human ships did not fire, did not pursue, did not even maneuver aggressively. They simply existed in places that made advance impossible, while on Earth Admiral Kade watched these developments with grim focus, reminding his staff that this phase was about demonstration, not annihilation, because humanity had learned the hard way that destroying enemies only created martyrs, but making aggression impossible rewrote politics itself, and so he authorized limited restoration corridors through the Curtain. Narrow paths of stable space-time offered to compact vessels that powered down weapons and acknowledged the closure, corridors that felt less like mercy and more like proof of absolute control, and as the first alien ships accepted the offer, broadcasting their compliance and voices tight with humiliation, the wider galaxy took notice. Trade routes collapsed overnight. Insurance markets froze, and neutral powers began issuing advisories warning all members to avoid human-influenced regions entirely, a phrase that would have sounded absurd weeks earlier but now carried the same gravity as black hole proximity warnings. And in the council chamber on Calf Prime, as one by one the delegates fell silent listening to incoming messages from their own admirals begging for guidance, the unthinkable realization settled in that this was not a battle they were losing. It was a strategic environment they no longer understood, engineered by a species they had dismissed as clever but small, emotional but predictable, unaware that those very traits had driven humans to plan not just for victory, but for the permanent prevention of conquest, and as ancient warnings finished translating on forgotten screens, stating in blunt language that humans did not seek dominion but would remake the galaxy rather than submit to it, the stars continued to go dark, not everywhere, not randomly, but precisely where the compact's power projection depended on the most, and for the first time in recorded history, the galaxy began to reorganize itself around the simple fact that Earth was not a world to be taken, but a force of nature that had finally decided to be felt. The shift from disbelief to accommodation happened unevenly across the galaxy, because while military hierarchies could respond to existential threat with drills and orders, civilizations built on the assumption of stable stars struggled to adapt to a universe where entire regions could simply opt out of known physics, and nowhere was this more evident than in the Orion Compact itself, where member states began quietly issuing contradictory instructions, some ordering their fleets to accept the human corridors immediately, others demanding symbolic resistance for domestic audiences even as the admirals stole for time, and in one notable case Compact-aligned Kingdom attempted to force passage through the Perseus Curtain with a ceremonial honor guard, only to have their flagship emerge hours later light years off course, intact but stripped of every data archive, every navigational record, and every strategic map it carried, as if the ship itself had been returned but its institutional memory erased, a warning so elegant and devastating that even the most hardline delegates fell silent, while on Earth the decision-making rooms grew quieter, not celebratory, because no one present mistook what was happening for victory in the old sense, as President Ionescu reminded the assembled leaders that humanity was now being watched not as a participant but as a precedent, and that how they concluded this crisis would determine whether the galaxy adapted or resisted until it tore itself apart, prompting Admiral Kade to authorize the next phase, controlled reillumination, a process by which select stars would be returned to visibility under new constraints, their gravitational and energetic behaviors subtly altered to include embedded human oversight nodes, effectively transforming key regions of space into shared but supervised environments, a concept that would have been called occupation by any other species but was framed carefully in transmissions as stabilization assistance, and when those stars flickered back into existence along major trade arteries, relief swept through commercial worlds even as dread followed close behind, because everyone understood that the stars had not returned because they were safe, but because humans allowed them to function, and as the first diplomatic envoys arrived at the edge of Sol under escort, their ships guided precisely through corridors that felt less like routes and more like permissions, they were met not by fleets or threats, but by a simple message broadcast from Earth stating that the closure was not punishment, that humanity did not seek tribute or territory, only recognition of boundary that would not be crossed again. And this confused the galaxy more than any display of power could have, because conquerors always wanted something tangible, while humans were demanding something abstract and far more disruptive, restraint enforced by capability rather than conquest, and in the council chambers on Calf Prime, where delegates now spoke openly of amendment rather than enforcement, a final archive finished decrypting, revealing that the extinct civilization that had authored the ancient warnings had once attempted to do what the Compact had just failed to accomplish, only to retreat after losing not worlds but certainty, and as that realization settled in, and as stars across human-influenced regions burned again under unfamiliar rules, the galaxy faced a choice it had, never prepared for, to continue treating power as something to be seized, or to accept that one species had learned how to change the rules instead, and would not unlearn that lesson. Acceptance did not come cleanly or all at once, because civilizations rarely abandon foundational assumptions without trying to bend them first. And so while official compact communiques spoke of dialogue and recalibration, unofficial channels buzzed with contingency planning, covert probes, and whispered speculation about whether the human control over stellar behavior was absolute or merely theatrical. A question that answered itself brutally when three separate powers attempted independent verification operations beyond the Perseus Curtain, each using different technologies and doctrines, and each failing in different but equally decisive ways, one expedition vanishing so completely that even its launch records were retroactively erased from local databanks as if causality itself had rejected the attempt. Another returning intact but reporting that their instruments had begun outputting mutually exclusive results simultaneously, rendering all data useless and driving several analysts into psychological collapse. And the third, most cautious of all, aborting its mission after detecting human observation signatures not attached to any identifiable platform, a presence described by command as being watched by the space between thoughts, and these reports, though suppressed publicly, circulated fast enough among elites to shift the conversation from resistance to survival. While on Earth the human leadership confronted its own fracture lines as protests erupted, in major cities, not against the use of power but against its permanence, voices arguing that humanity had become the very thing it once feared, and in response President Ionescu addressed the planet directly, stating without flourish that the choice had never been between power and innocence, but between preparation and extinction, a statement that resonated deeply with a species that remembered too well the cost of being unready. And beyond Sol, as trade slowly resumed along human-supervised corridors, new behaviors emerged, fleets traveling with unprecedented caution, diplomats speaking with unfamiliar humility, and younger civilizations looking to Earth not with terror but with something closer to awe, because humanity had not conquered their neighbors, had not demanded tribute, had not rewritten borders, and yet had accomplished something no empire ever had, making aggression obsolete within reach of its influence. And this quiet transformation culminated when the Orion Compact, formally suspended enforcement authority pending charter revision, a bureaucratic phrase that masked the truth that the galaxy's dominant power structure had been rendered unenforceable by a single species that refused to play by inherited rules. And as Admiral Kade stood before a live feed showing stars burning steadily again under altered constants, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, acknowledging that humanity would never be unseen again, never underestimated again, and that the burden of restraint would now be heavier than the burden of war, because from this point forward every decision Earth made would ripple through space-time itself, and far from Sol, in regions just beginning to register the changes, civilizations yet untouched by human influence looked up at their skies and wondered why certain stars felt different, not dimmer or brighter, but watched as if the universe itself had developed a memory and was paying closer attention than it ever had before. The galaxy adjusted in small practical ways before it adjusted philosophically, because survival always came before understanding, and so shipping lanes were rerouted to avoid regions marked with new human advisory codes. Military academies quietly rewrote curricula that had once treated humanity as a case study in rapid but shallow development, and intelligence services began classifying entire categories of observation as unsafe due to what analysts now term feedback risk, the growing body of evidence that attempting to analyze human stellar interventions too closely altered local conditions in unpredictable ways. While on worlds that depended on compact authority for stability, unrest grew as populations realized that the old guarantees no longer applied, that no fleet could arrive on schedule if space-time itself declined to cooperate, and this pressure forced political changes faster than wars ever had, with client states demanding autonomy and small alliances forming around shared neutrality toward Earth, a phrase that came to mean active avoidance rather than indifference, and through it all humanity remained conspicuously restrained, refusing requests to extend the Perseus Curtain outward, declining offers of joint stewardship, and rejecting even lucrative proposals to license the underlying technologies, not out of secrecy alone but because, as Admiral Kade explained in a closed briefing that later leaked, the systems were not tools in the conventional sense. They were commitments embedded into the structure of space, maintained by human decision-making loops that could not be safely divorced from the ethics that governed them, a statement that baffled alien technocrat accustomed to separating capability from responsibility, while within Sol debates continued to rage, some arguing that Earth should leverage its position to enforce lasting peace beyond advisory zones. others warning that expanding control would only recreate the same dominance. Structures that had led to this crisis, and in a compromise that satisfied no one fully but prevented fracture, humanity announced the establishment of observer sanctuaries, regions where stars burn under original constants and human influence were deliberately absent, a gesture meant to prove that the galaxy still had room to exist without oversight, and this act, more than any display of power, softened perceptions among younger species, because it demonstrated that Earth could choose not to, intervene even when it easily could. And as decades passed and compressed galactic time, the phrase Earth was supposed to fall instead the stars did faded from news cycles and into doctrine, taught not as a threat but as a warning about assumptions. And in the end, the Orion Compact did not collapse in fire or revolution. It dissolved through irrelevance, its enforcement mechanisms quietly mothballed, its authority replaced by negotiation frameworks that treated boundaries as real rather than theoretical. And somewhere deep beneath Earth's mountains, long after Admiral Kade had retired and President Ionescu's name had joined the plaques on the walls, maintenance crews still monitored systems that hummed softly through the planet. Not weapons waiting to fire, but safeguards waiting to never be needed again. Because humanity had learned that the greatest victory was not in making the galaxy fear them, but in teaching it that some lines, once drawn, could not be crossed without the universe itself pushing back. In the long view of galactic history, the crisis around Sol would eventually be reduced to timelines, footnotes, and revised constants in astrophysics textbooks. But for those who lived through it, the ending did not arrive with a single decisive moment so much as a gradual settling, like dust after a storm, as the universe accepted a new equilibrium, and humanity learned to live inside the consequences of what it had revealed. Because power on that scale did not fade just because it was unused. It lingered in every diplomatic exchange, every star chart annotation, every pause before a fleet commander authorized a jump near a human advisory region, while on Earth the generations that followed grew up knowing that the sky was not just something to explore but something their ancestors had altered, a knowledge that bred neither arrogance nor shame so much as vigilance. And so the systems beneath the mountains continued their quiet wake, tended by people who treated them less like machines and more like responsibilities passed hand to hand. While far beyond Sol, civilizations that had once dismissed humanity rebuilt their philosophies around limits, teaching that not all strength announced itself with conquest, that some powers existed solely to make certain outcomes impossible, and when historians finally translated the last of the ancient warnings left by the long-extinct precursors, they found not a prophecy of doom but a simple observation written in tired, careful language, that humans were a species shaped by loss, that they prepared not because they loved control but because they feared repeating mistakes, and that when they finally acted, it was never to dominate the galaxy but to make sure it could not dominate them. And so the stars that had gone dark remained altered forever, not hidden, not broken, but changed in subtle ways that reminded anyone who traveled near them that the universe remembered choices. And in that memory lay the true legacy of Earth, a world that was supposed to fall, that instead endured, and in enduring taught the galaxy that survival was not about who held the biggest fleets or the loudest councils, but about who understood when to draw a line and had the resolve to make even the stars respect it.